Hello and welcome to another video in the How to Make a Chrome Extension video tutorial series. In this video, I'm going to talk about the background.js file, how to pass messages from the popup.js file to the background JavaScript file, and how to store data in the background file. When we last left off, we had the start and stop button on click event listeners working. We had a little bit of console logs here, along with some truth value checks. Now what we want to do is send this data to the background.js file so it can do some operations on that data. Our background.js file is empty, and what we want to do in this file is create a message listener. But before I go into that, let me talk about what the background file really is. I have the documentation on the Chrome API pulled up here, and Chrome describes the background service worker as something that is event-based. So think events are browser triggers, navigating to a new page, creating a new tab, or even closing a new tab, running events in the background, or even lifecycle events like upgrading a Chrome extension or restarting the Chrome web browser. All of these are browser-specific events that the background.js file would be perfect for. If I go back to the background.js file, in here I want to start listening for certain message events. To do that, I'm going to create a message listener. The way that I do that is by using the Chrome API to add a listener to onMessage. I use chrome.runtime.onMessage, add listener, and then I give it a data param with a fat arrow. The data param is going to be an object that we define ourselves. It's something that we send from the popup.js file to the background.js file. I already know what that's going to look like for this application. It's going to look something like this. We'll have a switch statement. We'll define it on the data.event. We'll make two cases, one for onStop and onStart, and then we have to give it a default. Now you might be wondering, what is this exactly? Let me describe the data object. You can think of it as an object that looks something like this. You have an event of onStop or onStart, and then we'll define something called prefs. And prefs will be an object by itself. Prefs will contain the values in the popup.html, things like the location ID, the start date, and the end date. These are keys that we're going to be defining ourselves, and the values are taken from the inputs. Now that we have an understanding of what the data object looks like, I'm going to comment this out, and then I'm just going to write a console log in these cases. For the first onStop, I'll write onStop in background, and onStart, I will do the same thing, but I will say onStart in background. We have the background listening to messages that fit this format of onStop and onStart, but how do we send these messages from the popup file in here? We do that by using another Chrome API called sendMessage, and it looks something like this: chrome.runtime.sendMessage, and in here we're going to put that data object that I mentioned with an event on start. When the start button is clicked, this Chrome API will be initiated, which sends a message to the background.js, and inside of background.js, in the case statement of onStart, we should see onStart in background, and if we send onStop, we should see onStop in background. Let's add a send message for the stop button. I'm going to copy this down here. I'm going to delete the console log, and I'm going to change the event to onStop. I will also delete the logic inside of the start button. Great, let's give this a try. Back in my Chrome window, I hit refresh. In order to inspect the background.js file, you have to click the service worker. Remember, a background.js file is really just a service worker. We call it background because it's historically been called background.js, but it's really a service worker. So I'm going to click service worker. I'm going to organize my windows, open the extension, and I'm just going to hit save and start. And there you go. You see onStart in the background. If I hit stop, I see onStop in background, and I can keep doing these. Before I move any further, one thing I want to do, just a little bit of cleanup here, is I want to remove this function and use a fat arrow instead. So all that means is I'm going to delete the function here, put a fat arrow right after the parentheses. I'll do the same thing here. That looks a lot cleaner. Now what we need to do is in the start button, we have to fetch the value from the inputs and send it to the background file so it can do its operations on it. We already know what the data object is going to look like. It's going to have the event key value here, and then it's going to have a prefs key with an object of location ID, start date, end date in here. So we have to define an object inside of our start button that conforms to the prefs object that we just saw. We can do that by using location ID, and now we want to pull the value from the element, which is location ID.value. We want to do the same thing for the start date and end date elements. We've created the prefs here, and now we want to send it along with the send message object. We append prefs to the object that we are creating in the send message function. I'll head back to background.js, and inside of onStart, I'm going to do a console log of the prefs. Let's jump back to the Chrome extension with the background inspect open. Going to set some dates here. Hit save and start. These are the prefs that we receive in the background file. The end date, which is 1/12, the start date, which is 1/5, and Los Angeles, which is the location ID of the drop-down value selected. One thing we can do here to clean up our code a little bit is to use destructuring. We can do that by just specifying a const and then pulling out the values that we want from the object. In our case, we want event and prefs. So we'd write event, comma, prefs. Then we set that to data. Now we can just access event directly instead of having to do data.event and data.prefs. Another thing I want to do while we're here is create outlines for handling the onStop event and handling the onStart event. I'll create a const of handle onStop with another fat arrow function, and I'm going to move this console log inside of here. I'm going to create another fat arrow function, and I'll do the same thing down here. Now I'll call handle onStop and handle onStart and pass in the prefs here. This makes it a little easier on us in the future, so we don't really have to mess with this function too much. Now let's set up storing the preferences when we receive them in the background file. We can do that with another Chrome API called storage. It'll store it directly to the Chrome browser's local storage, which will allow us to store additional data and pull additional data in the future. Inside of handle onStart, I'm going to introduce another line. It's going to be chrome.storage.local.set. What we're normally going to be passing in here is an object. I'm going to call this prefs. Now that we've stored this data, we can pull this data when we need to use it. One place that we really need to pull data for is the pop-up window. If you notice, when you select a date, and even if you hit save and start, it never actually saves it. Once you dismiss the Chrome extension window and then you open it again, you actually never see that start date populated again. That's because the pop-up window is ephemeral, meaning it only survives for as long as it's visible. Once you deselect, it's destroyed along with the JavaScript file. So what we need to do is save the data, which is what we're doing right now, but also populate the data whenever the pop-up window is opened. Back in our code, let's jump over to the popup.js file. At the bottom here, I'm going to introduce another Chrome API. It's called storage get. So we do chrome.storage.local.get. We need an array of values to come back. What we need are location ID, start date, and end date. This takes a callback with a param of result. And this is just returning to us an object with all of the values that we requested. So what we can do here is the same thing we did back in the background.js when we pulled out event and prefs from the data object. A little bit of destructuring here by using const, location ID, start date, and end date. And we're going to point that to the result object. Now we can set the values of the inputs to these stored values. So first we need to make sure that it's valid. So location ID is valid. Then we set the location ID element dot value to the location ID. We do the same thing for the start and end dates. Great, so we have this data being saved. Let's give it a try. Hit refresh. Now let's save some data. I have Los Angeles selected here. For the start date, I'll put February 10th. And for the end date, I'm going to put March 9th. Hit start, jump out of the window, come back in, and there you go. The start date is selected, the end date is selected, and the location ID is selected. Let me switch that over to Seattle, hit save and start. It's populated once we open up the pop-up window again. And there we have it. We were able to store and retrieve data successfully. We now know how to send messages from the pop-up window to the background window. Next time, we're going to talk about how to handle lifecycle events, like when a Chrome browser is upgraded or if the Chrome extension is upgraded. And how do we start making API calls? How do we fetch the locations that we need to populate the drop-down list? And how do we do that dynamically in JavaScript? We're going to explore all of that in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe so I know to make more of these. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jerry Hacks.